You know, if you kind of like zoom out and look at the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole, it's actually kind of wild that it's still going on. Most long running franchises survive by locking into that formula and maybe just kind of refining it a little bit over the years. I mean, look at something like Dragon Quest. It's mostly been the same since the mid 80s and people love it. Tweaking some edges, upgrading some visuals, maybe streamlining some systems, but that core is intact for Dragon Quest. But Final Fantasy has never really done that. It reinvents combat, always, the tone, the worlds, and even sometimes the genre from one numbered entry to the next. And that's not necessarily a small thing. I mean, when you've built a loyal audience like Final Fantasy has, changing the DNA of everything can be really dangerous. But the flip side is this: without those risks, Final Fantasy probably wouldn't matter. So today I want to take a look at some of the biggest risks and biggest swings in the Final Fantasy series from its inception all the way now in 2026. So I'm really excited to look at all that stuff. But as always, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're not already. Leave your thoughts down below on the video. Maybe I'm missing something, or maybe you want to comment on one of the things that I'm talking about today. I would love to hear you guys. And yeah, let's get to the video. I think this is going to be a really interesting kind of deep dive into one of my favorite series. Now let's start with this one here, which is leaving Nintendo for PlayStation around the Final Fantasy VII era. This is a crazy move, and looking back, it made a lot of sense, but maybe at that time it was such a huge gamble considering this was a brand new console coming out on the horizon. I mean, when Square decided to move Final Fantasy VII to PlayStation versus the Nintendo 64, crazy. I mean, it wasn't just a technical decision. This was a real industry-defining moment. And Nintendo had been the home of the franchise from then. And some of you may still associate Final Fantasy with Nintendo if you're maybe a little bit older than me. But for me, I always see Final Fantasy as a PlayStation thing, and this started in 1997 with Final Fantasy VII. And walking away from that partnership, yes, was risky financially and creatively, but also at the same time, think of the payoff that has come since then. So, I mean, the most obvious reason why is cartridges could not hold what Square wanted to build. They envisioned cutscenes, crazy musical moments, and pretty much a more ambitious world than the Nintendo 64 could hold. And CDs allowed for that scale. But at that time, betting on PlayStation meant betting on a newer platform and a different audience. And then there's that whole aesthetic shift. Gone were the medieval settings here. In their place for Final Fantasy VII were industrial cities, corporate dystopia, environmental themes, and modern kind of weapons. It could have alienated longtime fans who loved that traditional vibe, but instead it turned Final Fantasy VII into a global phenomenon that still, to me, defines PlayStation. But to me, that leap isn't like a moment of refinement. It's a moment of reinvention and a moment of, dare I say, pardon the pun, rebirth for the Final Fantasy franchise. Next up is turning a mainline Final Fantasy game into an MMO with Final Fantasy XI, and then yes, that can kind of continue up until 14, but making Final Fantasy XI a fully online MMO was a really bold move, and this was not labeled as a side experiment, mind you. This was Final Fantasy XI, a numbered entry, and if you didn't want to play this, you were effectively sitting out on the next chapter of the franchise, which, as I'm reading this, I still haven't played it yet, so I may not ever get to it. But this was one that I always just kind of looked at from a distance and thought, interesting, but not for me. I mean, the idea of this is risky. Internet infrastructure wasn't universal at that time in the early 2000s, and console MMOs were still mostly unproven. I think the only thing that might have been comparable to it before then was Phantasy Star Online for the Dreamcast, correct me if I'm wrong. And the idea of paying monthly for a Final Fantasy experience was unfamiliar territory for many fans at that time as well. And then fast forward many years later was Final Fantasy XIV when it first released back in 2014, I think, and I played it, and at launch it was okay, it was interesting, and then the whole thing just kind of collapsed under its own weight. The launch was heavily criticized, and for a moment it felt like the brand had stumbled in a very public way, but instead of moving on, Square rebuilt everything. Shutting down a numbered entry and relaunching it as A Realm Reborn was a massive gamble of reputation. And it definitely could have, put the credibility at stake for at least Final Fantasy XIV. As you know, if you know anything about Final Fantasy or MMOs, it's probably the most respected MMO in the market right now, and proof that sometimes the biggest risk is obviously choosing not to give up. So going for MMOs for mainline entries, bit of a crazy gamble, not for me, but it's obviously proven very successful over time. Let's get on to our next one, which is one that I loved as a kid, and I know it is not for everybody. If you've played Final Fantasy X and sat with that ending, the sequel announcement probably was like, what? I can't even imagine seeing that sequel come out at that time and just being maybe okay with it. I mean, I personally loved it. I wasn't really totally aware of what the franchise was doing at that time, and I hadn't finished Final Fantasy X, so I just thought it was a continuation of maybe the vibe or the world or whatever, but I didn't really realize like what was actually happening. I mean, Final Fantasy X ends on a reflective kind of emotional vibe, and then Final Fantasy X-2 opens with a like J-pop concert and a higher energy mission system. It is a complete 180 from what 10 had going for it. And that tonal pivot is so huge. It's like tonal whiplash, really. Bright colors, idle aesthetics, campy humor, an all-female led trio. It felt like the franchise deliberately swerved away from a melodrama and leaned into style and personality. And yeah, a lot of people would have dismissed this as being unserious, and I know some people still do. But you know what? For what it's worth, it's actually a pretty good game. It contains one of the most refined battle systems in the series with the dress spheres, and it just reimagines that job system in a really fast and flexible way. Everything feels snappy, and yes, while the tone overall was divisive, the ambition was honestly undeniable. And if you like job systems like I've come to love in my old age, like Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy 5 and 3, you are going to love Final Fantasy X. Even if you can just ignore all the tone and the story stuff, like mechanically, it's a really solid game. And it's also a reminder that risk does not mean abandoning depth. For example, it just means presenting it in a different way. And Final Fantasy X-2 is a game that I actually really love. And that secret ending, oh boy, yeah, it's some good stuff. Now, hang on, before we get any further, I also wanted to let you know that almost 90% of the people that watch my channel on the regular are not subscribed. So if you like these kind of videos and you want more content every week in your YouTube subscription feed, I would love to have you. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and also I would love to know your comments on today's video as well. Anyway, more video right now. Final Fantasy XII is a different kind of game. I mean, if you were a fan of the series at that time, you would have thought that Final Fantasy X was like the last great game. And I know some people still think that, but let's look at Final Fantasy XII because this took a different approach for storytelling. Instead of centering everything on a clearly defined, highly emotional protagonist, it placed you right in the middle of a political conflict. And the narrative overall is like almost theatrical, long stretches focused on diplomacy and war and all these like power dynamics and stuff. It's very Star Wars, to be honest with you. And this is not an easy sell for like a mainstream RPG audience or maybe even a Final Fantasy audience. You have to pay attention. It does not spoon feed character arcs in the same overt way that earlier entries did. And then there's the Gambit system, which is not for everybody. This essentially lets you program your party's behavior in advance, and for some people, yes, that does feel like the game playing itself. This is something that's kind of grown on me over time. I played Final Fantasy XII to completion for the first time a couple years ago. I didn't really like it when I played it. I feel like I kind of forced myself through it. But in retrospect, I kind of have warmed up to the idea to the point where I would play through it again with more of an open mind, and chances are I would probably enjoy it a lot more the second time. And if you like that kind of stuff, this kind of gameplay might feel empowering. You really got to think strategically on a systems level rather than like a moment-to-moment level. 12 trusts the audience to adapt to this kind of rhythm. And yes, that kind of design confidence is a risk, especially in a franchise known for strong character-driven stuff and turn-based combat. You might have hoped for a turn-based entry considering 11 was a one-off MMO at that point, but man, everything just continued to shift from 10 onwards. But 12, I think it's a good game in its own right. Next up is Final Fantasy IX being a return to pure fantasy vibes. I mean, after 2 entries that pushed the series forward with more modern and futuristic vibes, going back to medieval kingdoms of black mages and crystal mythologies felt a little bit different, but also I think this game was more of a love letter to the franchise than anything else. And the character designs leaned into more stylization than realism. Of course, 7 and 8 had more human-looking characters, but here we had some different-looking creatures and different-looking people. And in retrospect, it kind of felt like a smaller, more cozy game overall. And there's always danger in revisiting these kind of vibes, especially at a time when the industry at that time in the late 90s, early 2000s was pushing towards more realistic visuals and edgier tones. This is a more fantasy approach, and in retrospect, I think it was a really good gamble. But it wasn't like a regression, it was a reflection and like a tribute to the series as a whole up until that point. It distilled what made those early games special. You know, all the themes hit really well, just as hard as anything in the more modern entries now. And the risk overall wasn't that it looked like new old school, it was that it trusted that nostalgia for the early Final Fantasy games to carry some real thematic weight, and I think it did a really wonderful job. And obviously, if you've played Final Fantasy IX, chances are it might be in your top 10, top 3, maybe top 2, or even your favorite Final Fantasy game. So it's a game that I love, a return to roots game, and a beloved entry overall. Spoilers for Final Fantasy VII here. Yes, we're talking about Final Fantasy VII again, but this was an insane moment. So if you haven't played it, I mean, come on, it's almost 30 years now, but killing Aerith, narratively, one of the boldest decisions in RPG history. She's not just a temporary guest character, like she's a core party member, and you level her up, you invest in her equipment, you build strategies around her abilities if you used her in your party, and then boom, she's just gone. It's insane. And at that time, most RPG players were kind of trained to believe that death was reversible. I mean, like Phoenix Downs, hello. I mean, those are things, and then revival spells and all that stuff. There was usually a loophole, but this was not a fake out. The game forces you to just witness it, accept it, and there's no resurrection, there's no nothing, regardless of what you might have heard on the playground in the late 90s back then. My gosh, I remember hearing everything about the reviving Aerith theories and stuff, or she comes back on disc 3, like all that stuff. But this permanence was risky because, you know, you might have been angry and it could have felt manipulative, but instead it made that whole world and all those moments up until then feel really real and fragile. And it told players that, man, there's stuff at stake here. And in doing so, I really think that Final Fantasy VII was a pivotal game in how people viewed storytelling in games, especially within the genre of JRPGs. Last up, we have Final Fantasy XVI being a full action game with a solo, single character focus. 16, if you've played it, I think it's a really great game. I know it's not for everybody. This leans harder into action combat than ever before. This is not a hybrid system. This is a fast, combo-driven combat system designed with one character in mind. The traditional party micromanagement is gone, and I know this is not for everybody, and some people even just describe it as Devil May Cry Final Fantasy, more or less. And for longtime fans who associate Final Fantasy with menu-driven strategy or party synergy that you even get in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, this is a significant shift, and it raises questions about genre identity. Is it still an RPG in the traditional sense? Or is it evolving into something maybe more adjacent to that? But at the same time, even if you don't like the game, it's hard to deny that 16 embraces that cinematic spectacle in a way that not every game tries to do and does well. The icon battles are huge. I love those sequences. It's a clear statement that as time grows, Final Fantasy just refuses to be boxed in, and even at the risk of dividing the fan base, it's just part of the franchise's DNA at this point. And I really liked Final Fantasy XVI overall. It was a fantastic game, great narrative. Clive, my number 2 Final Fantasy protagonist of all time. Yes, action combat, not for everybody, but I just thought it was a really wonderful game and a really wonderful experience that had me in tears a majority of the game. It's a real heartbreaking story, but man, I had fun. So there's just a handful of big swings and huge moments that really just defined Final Fantasy over the years. Did I miss anything? Please let me know. This is just a handful that I thought that I would add in today. And yeah, some really great standout moments for me, just thinking back on the series as a whole. I've been a fan of it since I was a kid back in the late 90s, and I'll always love it even if things change and evolve, and that's good. I'm glad to see it grow, but not every game is going to be a hit, and that's okay. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, comment your thoughts, and we'll see you in another video next week. Bye-bye.